Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the federal bureaucracy, which is part of our executive branch. We remember that the president is the head of the executive branch. Well, the president isn't outside patrolling the streets, taking care of business all by himself. The president actually has millions, that's right, millions with an M, of federal employees to do the business that the government has set out to do. When we think about the bureaucracy, we can kind of think about workers like what are pictured here. We see an EPA worker vacuuming gasoline out of the Colorado River, and we would say that this is a job that isn't mentioned in the Constitution. There is no mention of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, no mention of which organization is supposed to clean up gasoline and other environmental hazards. Yet the bureaucracy comes into existence due to need. And Congress is the one that funds all of these bureaucracies and all of these endeavors, and the president is entrusted to be the manager of these affairs. So let's do a broad overview of what the federal bureaucracy is all about. Whenever Congress creates laws, someone's got to be out there to enforce it. And the federal bureaucracy implements laws that are created by Congress. When we think about the bureaucracy, we should recognize that it is somewhat caught between two oversight groups, the president and his trusted advisors, and also Congress and the various committees that have been established by the House or the Senate. The Constitution does not provide a ton of details about the bureaucracy. The Constitution merely says that the president shall have a trusted group of advisors if the president so pleases. And therefore, we see the basis for this team of organizers to get the job of the presidency done. And when we think of new departments that are created in our bureaucracy, we should recognize that they're usually created in response to multiple crises. A lot of our bureaucratic departments, bureaus, agencies, they come to fruition in a time post-Great Depression, where the United States was trying to clean up some of these economic messes, and in doing so, it created a bunch of departments, bureaus, and agencies to handle these crises. Now, one thing to note about the federal bureaucracy, yet again, is that they can make policies. Keep in mind, these officials, these members of the federal government are not elected. They are hired to do a job by direct supervisors, trusted officials in government, high-level government officers, and then ultimately, the only person in the federal bureaucracy who is elected is the president as head of the executive branch. So we can see the bureaucracy at work. The president, the federal departments and agencies, and the people. We can look at the president, Congress, and the courts. These elected offices in government and the courts, which are appointed by the president, we can see that they often give inconsistent and contradictory messages to the federal departments and agencies. When I'm saying federal departments and agencies, I'm thinking the Environmental Protection Agency, the FBI, the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and more. And so the president may have a certain agenda for these agencies, and the Congress and the courts may direct them to do otherwise. When we think of how the people come into play, we can think of the people, the mass public. They have indirect control over the bureaucracy through public opinion measurements, through elections by electing the president and key members of Congress to oversee this bureaucracy. And interest groups can influence presidential and congressional behavior as well as that of the courts. The courts can often place a check on these agencies and departments in times where these departments are maybe acting unconstitutionally. The people also have some direct say over these federal departments and agencies through public opinion, elections, and social movements. Only occasionally and intermittently do they influence the bureaucracy directly. And so the bureaucracy may have to take public comments, and the public can weigh in, send a comment on a website whenever there's a proposed rule change by these federal departments, and these agencies have to take them into consideration, yet they're free to make the decisions that they see fit so long as they're constitutional. So long as the president is willing to accept these efforts, Congress is willing to fund it, and the courts do not strike down any of their efforts. So, to become a member of the federal bureaucracy, we have to go back to see how the hiring process has changed. We can focus on the Civil Service Act of 1883 and how it was able to change this dynamic process of hiring. The Civil Service Act of 1883 created a hiring system for bureaucracy, which was based on merit. This is different from the previous spoils system, which awarded jobs based on political connections. Could you imagine if the government and these various important jobs were doled out as political favors based on who you knew and not what you could do, not what your qualifications suggested? This means that under the spoils system, anyone who had a connection to someone in government, they could get a job quite easily. Now, since 1883, that is no longer the case. And yet, at the highest levels of government, jobs are still filled with political appointees. Though there is a merit system for the millions of individuals working in government, at the highest levels, such as the cabinet secretary positions like the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, these offices are filled by presidential appointees. And so it's the president, once they're elected, they get to select who they want to do these jobs. Does it matter if they have the required degree? Does it matter if they have work experience in this field? No. What matters is that the president wants them to do the job and that Congress is willing to confirm that appointment as part of their appointment power. Now, thinking of the number of employees in the federal government, one common misconception is that the bureaucracy has grown over the past few decades, but that's not quite true. When we think of what was taking place in 1968, we saw close to 3 million civilian employees. These are non-military personnel, going back to 1968. But fast forward a few decades to the year 2012, that number is reduced to 2.8 million, a cut of over 200,000 jobs. Now, when we think of military personnel, this is where the numbers become most dramatic. In 1968, there were 3.6 million Americans who were serving in the American military. But fast forward to 2012, that number is cut almost in half to 1.4 million. We see that the federal bureaucracy has not grown significantly. And when we compare it to the national workforce, what this chart tries to illustrate is how over the past few decades, fewer people are working in the federal bureaucracy than ever. In 1950, close to 5% of the public worked at some level in the federal government. But by 2015, that number is reduced to 2%, meaning people are taking up more private sector jobs today than they are federal government jobs. So that's something to consider when making these claims about the size of government. At least as far as employees go, it is not as stark. It has not grown significantly. Now, when we think of the executive branch, this federal bureaucracy, basically think of them as the body of the executive branch, going out and carrying out the will of what the head of the executive branch or president wants to do. And so underneath the president, as we discussed in previous lecture videos, cabinet members of the president, they are heads of departments. These departments carry out the most essential functions of government. For example, the Secretary of Defense manages the war effort. There's a Secretary of State which oversees foreign policy, how to keep diplomatic relations with foreign nations. There's the Secretary of the Treasury who oversees the Department of the Treasury, and they manage the country's money creating abilities. Now, when we look at who the current cabinet officials are, we can see that there have been some appointees under President Trump that fill these roles. Going back to one of the earliest created positions, the Secretary of State, this whole department was formed in 1789. And as of today, there are around 69,000 employees of the State Department. They receive an annual budget of over $90 billion as of 2015. And our current Secretary of State, his name is Mike Pompeo. Now, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State oversees the 69,000 employees of the State Department. We see how this official, though they report to the president, when they go and manage the affairs of the State Department, they are essentially the bosses of these 69,000 employees. Same goes for the Treasury. The Treasury was created just after the Department of State. The Treasury Department, created in 1789, they currently recently had an employee number of 86,000, and they received $20 billion in funding from Congress. The Secretary of the Treasury is someone who oversees the Treasury, and this includes certain agencies like the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, to make sure you're paying your taxes. Now, when it comes to the Department of Defense, this is perhaps one of the most high-level budgets spending groups. When we think of the Defense Department, they receive $717 billion. Notice this dwarfs the $90 billion received by the State Department, the $20 billion received by the Treasury Department. Our current Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, is entrusted to manage these funds. The Department of Justice is headed by William Barr, and he is the Attorney General for the country. This is the only cabinet-level position that does not take the title of Secretary. It is the Attorney General, and this person oversees the 113,000 plus employees in the Department of Justice, or DOJ. In the Department of Justice, there are many smaller bureaus which oversee very precise crimes, very precise, detailed types of crimes. So the FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That falls within the Department of Justice. When we think of the DEA, that too falls in the Department of Justice, but that deals with drug enforcement. We see that these departments have a lot of responsibilities. So just to review, the oldest is the State Department, and the Defense Department has close to 3 million employees, 2.86 million. Many of these are military personnel sworn in. Just going back, before we move on, the Interior Department, that oversees the national park system. And so park rangers, federal national parks, these are sought after and overseen by the Secretary of the Interior. Now let's just go over a few here. The Secretary of Commerce oversees the Department of Commerce, and they have the smallest budget at $9.67 billion. Health and Human Services. If you thought that the United States military was the largest budgetary item, well, it's the second largest. The largest budget in the federal executive branch is the Department of Health and Human Services, which this number here, $1,171 billion, that's $1.1 trillion worth of spending every year. These are massive expenditures. And so the Secretary of Health and Human Services, they are going to oversee, and this will also include organizations within it like the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, which is currently managing the global pandemic of the coronavirus. So we see these different departments, they have certain responsibilities to try to keep Americans healthy, housed, or well-fed thanks to their agriculture dealings. A couple more offices, let's just spotlight a few. The newest department created was the Department of Homeland Security, which was created back in 2002 as a response to the attacks of September 11th, 2001. And when we think of what these other departments like the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Energy, of Education, Veterans Affairs, they all oversee crucial areas of life to try to make life better for Americans in a number of ways. Now, a second level of organization, we just went through the top level, all the departments. Within the departments, there are subdivisions known as bureaus. So, for example, the FBI and the DEA are both bureaus that are overseen by the Department of Justice. There's also something called independent executive agencies. And what's unique about these agencies is that they report directly to the president. They do not have to go through the middleman of a cabinet level department official. So some examples of independent executive agencies are the EPA, the CIA, and NASA. When we think of NASA, or NASA is an example of an independent agency. They deal with space travel and all affairs of the United States as it deals with outer space. There are other parts of the executive branch. Some are called government corporations. Government corporations are designed to perform economic activity that private investors are unwilling to do. So, for example, what's been discussed recently in the news is the Postal Service. This is a government corporation. Now, we have many private shipping companies as well. Think of UPS, think of FedEx. These are shipping companies who will deliver your packages for a cost, for a fee. However, the Postal Service, they actually have very low fees. Think about how you can send a letter anywhere in the United States for under $1. This would include remote parts of the country, including Alaska, including Wyoming, and more. Now, when we think of the Postal Service, like other government corporations, what stops FedEx or UPS from delivering to these remote parts of the country like Alaska? Well, it's simple. Private investors, private businesses like the UPS and FedEx, they are not interested in having shipping routes that lead to certain customers who would have just maybe one parcel every year. And therefore, they don't have routes that go to the most remote parts of the country. However, the Postal Service is created by the federal government to go out and make sure that Americans are connected and that these Americans can have their packages delivered, that they can be in contact with the federal government, they can make use of these services. And this is seen, even though it at times loses money, it is seen as a loss leader, that this helps the economy in a number of ways that without the Postal Service, it wouldn't function as well. Finally, number 5, we have what are called independent regulatory commissions. And these independent regulatory commissions regulate sectors of the economy in which the free market may need oversight. So, for example, the SEC, or Securities and Exchange Commission, they oversee investments that are made by private individuals, people who broker on the stock market, for example, and make sure that people aren't using unfair advantages in their dealings, that they are playing by the law, so to speak. And so we would say that they are trying to make sure that the economy, the free market, even though it is free, that the people cannot manipulate it. And there we have it. The federal bureaucracy is massive. Here we see a chart showing how the Constitution is the source of power for the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and then what we've been talking about all chapter long, the executive branch. At the top of the executive branch is the president. The president has many trusted advisors, and the president also oversees the heads of these important departments like the Department of Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services, and more. Also, the president oversees these independent establishments and government corporations like the Peace Corps, like the Central Intelligence Agency, like the Farm Credit Administration, like the Office of Government Ethics and the United States Postal Service. We see that all of these bureaus and all of these departments, all of these leaders report to the president. When we think of the president, their job is to act as CEO of the federal government. And so when we analyze the goals of the bureaucracy, we're going to see that there are a number of ways which the federal government tries to achieve these goals. Let's talk about national security. When we think of national security, there are certain departments that are responsible for national security, such as the State Department, which handles diplomacy with foreign nations. The Department of Defense, their job is to coordinate military personnel. The Department of Defense is full of officials and generals and other military leaders who make sure that America's military forces are executing their orders properly. And so the Department of Defense is the federal bureaucracy which oversees the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and more. It also oversees the NSA. Now, there is a separate video I will post of the NSA. I'll ask you to watch that now. So pause here for just a brief second and watch that video in the discussion board attached. All right, we're going to come back. I'm going to assume that you watched it and we'll move on. So another department that oversees national security is the Department of Homeland Security. DHS, as it's abbreviated, has the power to detain terrorist suspects, and they also engage in domestic intelligence. So some bureaus within the Department of Homeland Security, you may have heard of ICE, or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. These groups are designed to handle the challenges of keeping Americans safe on domestic soil. So when we think of the many ways we can reform the bureaucracy, people have said there are certain groups or certain organizations which may have pose a threat to civil liberties or pose a threat to the American way of life. And reforming the bureaucracy has led to different efforts to improve. Democrats as a party, as a political platform, have aimed to make the existing bureaucracy more effective, reducing the number of employees, reducing duplicate or redundant bureaus and departments. Republicans have aimed to privatize government work or downsize it, meaning firing employees, closing down certain departments, and reducing budgets in a number of ways. So let's talk about the Republicans, what many Republicans prefer, privatization. What is privatization? Privatization involves a formerly public service that is now provided by a private company. And so when we think of this service, there are certain services that are still paid for by the government, but they're run by private businesses. Some examples of privatized businesses in the United States would include federal prisons. If you think about running a federal prison, we should recognize it's a costly endeavor. Think of all of the supplies you would need to have on hand in order to run a prison. You'd need to pay for all the guards, their salaries, their training, their health insurance, their dental plans, any training they need to do with their firearms, and more. Think of the insurance costs, the medical fees, the utilities, the food, the uniforms, the upkeep of the building. There are a lot of costs. Now, when Republicans prefer to privatize, what they're trying to do is reduce the cost of government. They're trying to reduce the cost of this service by giving it to a private business to oversee, because a private business may say, all right, we can try to make a profit here. You, as the government, give us a fee. We'll try to do it for less. But the challenge with privatization, and the main critique among Democrats, is that accountability is also a problem. When we think about private businesses, they are driven by profit incentive. And so private businesses, they may make decisions, cost-cutting decisions, in order to turn a profit that may reduce the overall goal of what Americans would want, which is accountability, making sure that these services are conducted fairly, accurately, and without problematic efforts. Now, wherever you stand on this, keep in mind, just know that this is a very challenging, dynamic topic. It is nuanced, and it's something to consider. Privatization, it has its pros, reducing the cost. It has its challenges. By handing over the keys, so to speak, to a private service, we could see that there's some loss of direct government control. What other businesses could we privatize? Could we privatize the American military? Could we privatize cybersecurity? Could we privatize the overseeing of nuclear weapons? We could privatize any government service. However, people have been hesitant to privatize everything because the goal has been to always reduce the cost of government, but recognizing that government needs to have accountability. So let's review. Since the 1950s, this is a potential question on your exam. Since the 1950s, compared with the entire workforce, the number of federal employees has it A, increased sharply, B, increased slightly, C, gradually declined, or D, saw no change? If you answered C, we can recognize that in the 1950s, this number was at 5%. Flash forward to 2015, that number drops to 2%. It drops over a matter of decades, very gradual. Which department deals with issues of national security? Is it the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, or is it D, all of the above? Well, as we went over, all of these departments deal with national security. They just do so in different ways. The Department of Defense oversees the American military. The State Department houses all of the American diplomats overseas, trying to create bonds and relationships with members of foreign governments. And the Department of Homeland Security is interested in preventing terrorist acts on American soil. So we see all of them. Even though they have a clear singular goal, they deal with matters in different ways. So that's it for the bureaucracy. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've seen just how large the federal government can be. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in your discussion boards, or if you want to discuss it over Zoom or on office hours, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Take care, and I'll see you soon.